Mayday here. 82, we have smoke in the cabin.
72, the track, final maintain.
Good evening. Welcome to this special presentation of Galactic Terrors to showcase a new anthology called Where the Silent Ones Watch. I am hosting. I am James Chambers, and this is the online reading series that scours the known universe for scary stories, strange tales, weird horror, and all sorts of literary oddities from the most imaginative authors writing in a variety of fascinating genres. And tonight, we have quite a lineup. Instead of our typical 3 or 4 readers, we have a cast, an all-star cast of thousands. So I'm going to bring some of the authors who are here on board. So welcome, Todd Kiesling, Tim Waggoner, Patrick Freivald, Kyla Lee Ward, L.E. Daniels, Andy Davidson, Aaron Dries, Pete Rawlik, and Sal Ciano, and Linda Addison, who is trapped between dimensions at the moment and having difficulty materializing her image.
But I can talk.
Yes, that's the best part. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we jump in, I'll just give those in the audience a quick introduction to what we are here to talk about. We're going to be looking at this new anthology, Where the Silent Ones Watch, which I have edited and was recently published by Hippocampus Press, and includes poems and stories by all the great folks who are on this live stream at the moment, some who will be joining us a little bit later, and some who are not going to be joining us tonight, but still contributed amazing work to this book. In fact, I'm just going to throw this up here quickly, and you can see our entire line of contributors. So quite a few outstanding authors have brought their ideas and visions to the themes and notions of William Hope Hodgson. So who is William Hope Hodgson? So I've had to answer that question more than a few times lately. Is there anyone here who'd like to jump in and answer it tonight, or should I go ahead and give the spiel?
My understanding is he was a man.
Indeed. Yes. All right. He was more than that, Todd. He was an author. He was a writer of weird fiction and horror.
Gee willikers, Jim. What kind of author was he?
He was a British author, born in, I think, when I'm forgetting the name of the town, Blackwell, I think. Blackmore End in England in 1877. I'm checking my handy cheat sheet here in Where the Silent Ones Watch. He published his first short story, The Goddess of Death, in 1904. He died in 1918, obliterated by an artillery shell in Ypres, Belgium, during World War I. And in between, he wrote 4 foundational works of weird horror: The House on the Borderland, The Nightland, Boats of the Glen Carrig, and The Ghost Pirates. He created Carnacki the Ghost Finder, wrote the stories of the Sargasso Sea, and wrote quite a lot of non-supernatural adventure stories and naval stories, to which he brought a great deal of authenticity, going from his 10 years as a sailor. And if you haven't read Hodgson yet, and you're watching this, I suggest you make a point of checking out some of his work. Probably the most accessible, and actually, I think the most accessible is probably The House on the Borderland. But what do you all think? Would you agree, or do you think there's a better place to start?
No, I think so. I think that's probably the most accessible, although not my favorite of his, but maybe because my favorite of his is less accessible.
Though you shouldn't sell Carnacki short.
Hmm.
I think the first piece I read by Hodgson was The Hog. So jumping in at the deep end.
Voice in the Night is kind of really accessible. I think it's been adapted both officially and unofficially like 2 or 3 times. So yeah.
One of those adaptations is the Japanese horror film Matango, Attack of the Mushroom People. And just to give Hippocampus Press a plug for their great books, they have also recently released The Voice in the Night, a collection, the best weird stories of William Hope Hodgson. So if you do need to find a copy of The Voice in the Night, Hippocampus can hook you up. All right. So these are stories that are blends of supernatural horror, House on the Borderland and the Nightland in particular, and even the Ghost Pirates to some extent are sort of proto-science fiction in a lot of ways, and even cosmic fantasy. So there's a lot to work with when looking at William Hope Hodgson's writings, his imagination, his themes and ideas. And I thought it would be fun to explore those in an anthology. So tonight we're going to dive in a little bit to what has inspired each of the contributors to write their piece, and maybe read just a quick sort of flash reading piece from it to give you a little bit of the flavor of their story. So I think we'll go ahead and start with, how about Aaron? Would you like to kick us off? You have a story that I just love the backstory behind your piece.
Okay, so my story is called Bellow of the Steamship Cow. If nothing else, I just love saying the name. It's the backstory here. I guess you asked a very interesting question before, James, about what was our first entryway into Hodgson's work, and he can be a tough nut to crack. And when the opportunity to submit for this anthology came up, I tried to navigate my way into that world, and I decided instead to take a different route and to look at Hodgson's actual life and upbringing. And so I've written a piece of a true story up to a point, at which point things get weird. But it starts off with a true event that happened in Hodgson's life. And for a little bit of backstory, so prior to him becoming a writer, as you mentioned before, he grew up as quite a slim child, picked on and bullied. He was diminutive in size, and he enlisted in the Navy and was still even picked on whilst there. And yet he was the first person who would jump overboard into shark-infested waters to fish out his fellow seamen who had fallen overboard. And yet still he was copping it left, right, and center. And then when he kind of emerged from his Navy life and all those years on the boats, he opened up a school of physiotherapy. He became a bodybuilder. He took all those insecurities you can imagine and started to put it into sculpting his body so that he was larger in size. And but by all accounts, from what we've read, he still struggled, and so he would challenge people to public fights and to displays of physical prowess. And one of the people that he challenged in front of a crowd in 1902 was Harry Houdini. And it did not go well for Harry Houdini. And so that is the background context of my story. It's I'm telling the story of what happened that night, and also digging deep into some of the stuff in Hodgson's life that you can read into between the lines, so to speak. And it starts in a world that's relatable and it ends up somewhere hopefully really quite other. James, shall I launch into my little reading? Is that the way to go?
Yeah, please do.
All right. So here's a brief excerpt from Bellow of the Steamship Cow, inspired in part by actual events. And I'll start at the beginning. Just another Budapest baby manacled to an umbilical cord in 1897. Only this one was unaware of his escape until he broke free of the womb and emerged into the spotlight with a slap on the bum. His name was Eric Weiss, and he had transitioned from one world to another, in to out, warm to cold, blackness to brightness, and soon from Hungary to America, where he would, as Eric of the Air, master the trapeze by the tender age of 9. Later, he would go by Handcuff Houdini, a pseudonym he chose himself in tribute to his idol, the French magician Robert Houdin. Vaudevillian, rope whisperer, charmer of the chain, Harry Houdini. Death was a plum he bit to tempt the pit inside, licking the juice from his chin for the tramp coins turned fortune that they threw at his feet. It wasn't always a blessed life. Accused of faking and bribery many times over, threatened with the implementation of the lunacy law, a string of failed relationships, the constant rupture and repair with his family, dodging both Russian influenza and the bubonic plague. There were times, though mostly after opium or mescal binges with carny folk, when Houdini's desire to trick himself back into his mother's womb called loud and clear, a tightrope he walked again and again until he met Bess. Bess kept him safe as his saintly mother, or so thought the handcuff king, until one night in late October 1902. With the arrogance awarded those who fall like men but land like cats, Harry Houdini strode into the Blackbourne Theatre on the corner of Jubilee Street and Railway Road with his wife, his brother and doctor, a building with a 25-foot proscenium and a 30-foot deep stage. He was confident of another success, but tonight he would experience the sea. Tonight he met William Hope Hodgson. And I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, Aaron. Thank you so much. I love that you were digging into Hodgson's life. His personal life is almost as interesting as his fiction, I think. I've found the more that I've read about him and of him, the more interesting he becomes.
Yes, he had a fascinating life, and he enlisted after he started off as he was in the Navy. He was a photographer, he was an artist, he was a writer, and he was a believer in physical health, but also riddled with insecurities. And then he enlisted to go to war and was discharged due to ill health, and then re-enlisted, left his wife to go back to war, where he was then he then died on the field. And this particular story tracks all of that there. And there is also just, there's a mystery at the core of his life and his personal life, which we can only speculate about. And I guess I dig into it as respectfully as I can in this story.
Yes. And he was, I'm going to put up a picture of Hodgson. He was rather photogenic as well. As you can see.
As Houdini was not so photogenic, and Houdini throughout the story keeps referring to him as a prissy bastard.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. Why don't we talk to, let's say, Andy? Are you ready to tell us a little bit about what inspired your Hodgson story and where you went with it? Because you went to a very different place than most anyone would ever think of for Hodgson.
Well, I was thinking while Aaron was talking that there are some elements of his biography that sort of dovetail with some of the things that I was working on. I am from the South. I grew up in the South and have lived all over the South. And my work, my writing has tended to focus on that region. And so I'm obsessed with kind of picking at the South through the horror lens. And I've long been working on ways to bring in cosmic horror in the kind of Lovecraft and mythos and such. And so Hodgson's this kind of neat, sort of untapped well, I think. I didn't know much about him before this project, honestly. And so my entry point was the Nightlands. And I've been sort of thinking about Memphis wrestling a lot, specifically Memphis wrestling in the 1970s. And so those elements of his biography, the bodybuilding, and this kind of this idea of the Nightland and the pyramid, these things all just sort of came together for me in a story set on the night of Elvis Presley's death in 1977, when this character that I've got in my head by the name of LeBlue, who's an ex-wrestler, he's trying to consolidate his power, and he's made some dark deals with nefarious forces from beyond. And so the scene that I'm going to read, my story is called Out in the Night with the Memphis Dead, sort of as an homage to a title from Hodgson. And so the scene I'm going to read, LeBlue and his henchmen have taken LeBlue's former mentor down to the Mississippi River on the Arkansas side of the Memphis skyline. And they've murdered him and sacrificed him to these dark forces so that LeBlue's fate can be realized. So I got a paragraph here I'll read. Later, when the messy part was done, the leftovers dumped in the river, LeBlue set the 4 blood-smeared jars at the edge of the bluff, their offerings inside, and watched as the lightning blazed over the city. It was long and leggy, walking lightning, cutting sideways through the sky, just as the curved blade had cut through Johnny Vegas's gut. LeBlue stood touching the talisman through his shirt and muttered arcane words that had never been pronounced aloud. He muttered them in conjunction with the names of all the wrestlers whose souls he would own as king of the books, Mid-South promoter supreme. And in that moment, he saw a spear of lightning stab down and split the Memphis shore wide open. And there, revealed in that flash, was the other land. A sunless land of red ash and belching smoke stretching away to an infinite and darkling plain of night where the end of man awaited, and terrors lurked with hunger for human souls. Beyond the veil of the pulsing clouds, a fearsome being reared over the city, a beast god of no name, of no age, tall and broad and many-armed, with eyes of flame and a maw that opened like the craggy mouth of a volcano. And this was the one to whom LeBlue had long prayed, the source of his sight, his mama's gift, the source of all his gifts. He understood at last that this was the nameless entity he had long courted in his anger, his desire for vengeance, his greed for what he was owed. A true king, a king of blood, showing LeBlue the future he would shape here along the Memphis shore, a pyramid in this city of antique name, miles high and touching the clouds, a vast arena where the champions of days long past would be remembered, and the young would fight 2 and 4 and 6 to a card, for the old Mid-South would surely pass away, and the new Mid-South would be fashioned in the image of Henri Babe LeBlue, and all the fears he had ever felt would be as wilting flowers in comparison to the greatness and reality and terror of the thing he would become. Such is the monstrous futureness of this which I have seen. Of this I will become, a pyramid on the borderlands, a last redoubt of glory, a haven for heroes. So I came at it from a slightly sideways approach.
Yes. Thank you so much, Andy. And we actually have a question, and that reminds me, for anyone watching, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. We're happy to answer questions. But this one actually comes from Patrick, and I'm not sure what that means. LeBlue Cyclone.
Oh, don't worry about it. That was me being slightly silly. Don't worry about it.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. I thought it might have been a wrestler I wasn't familiar with.
Blue Cyclone is a wrestler in a song by Ray Stevens.
That is true.
I wasn't sure if it was intentional because of the Southern thing and everything else, if there was that intent of humor there or not. But
it's not, but I remember the song. I know the song. So there you go.
Okay. But that's kind of amazing to me, Andy, that you started with the Nightland. The Nightland generally is considered his most challenging book to read, and only because of the style, the sort of anachronistic language and the density of the prose. But I find it to be also the work, Hodgson's work, that's just the most overflowing with weirdness and strange ideas and original visions. So, but yeah, I think it's so have you gone on to read any other Hodgson?
I have not. And I confess I'm still working my way through the Nightlands, which is, it's a big book.
It is. Well, the Nightland proved to be particularly popular, as a kind of a jumping off point. So let's go, Kyla, to you at this point, because I know you also looked to the Nightland, and tell us a little bit about where you were coming from with that.
Oh, I did indeed. I'd always meant to read the Nightland, so this provided me with just that little push, and over the cliff I went. Now, what I find in Hodgson's work, it's a massive contradictions. And I think it comes from the fact he was writing at the very pivot point of the new century. He was at a point of incredible change, and yet the past, the Victorian era, was still very much present and alive, especially for him. And so we have things like the Nightland is like one of the original Gothics, like Radcliffe or Maturin, smashed into the most extreme, far future science fiction setting. I think that is even one of the most extreme that has ever been created. In The Hog, it's a tale of classic diabolism, but the magic circle, it's electrical. All these contradictions. And anyway, out of all that, somehow arose the Battlements of Twilight, my own rather peculiar tale. The Bastion. It was never my home, for I had fled terror and blood, and could not settle within those vast grey chambers, punctuating a corridor spiralling down, down, down. But they haunt my dreams still, merging with my memories of the purge of Cephalus and the love I lost there. The founder of our order, the prognosticant Abelard, had foreseen our need and sunk the bastion to the utmost reaches of the southern waste. But it was Abelard's prediction of the great disaster which would rend the earth, and our perhaps overzealous efforts to spread knowledge of the same, that brought the purges upon us. When people spoke of me, it was of the psychometrist daemon, my talent that of reading memories. Not a common talent, nor one of the more potent, but my days were busy and I was happy. But then came the day my love and I must also flee. We were separated in the crowd as the guns roared. Returning under cover of darkness, I touched the pavement, and I knew. Grief dwelt in the bastion, side by side with anger and fear. Doubt ran wild through the corridor. Resentment brewed in the small cells we were allotted. And yet the order's work continued, determining the surest means of humankind's survival in defiance of those who wished to destroy us. I thank you.
Thank you, Kyla.
I'm clapping for everybody, even though you can't see me.
We believe you, Linda. I think the different takes on the Nightland really struck me as I was putting the anthology together, and the takes that sort of hewed closer to the actual source material, like I think Kyla, yours is a little more clearly set in the world of the Nightland, whereas Andy's is so removed from it. And I had actually had, I think the way it came together with the Nightland stories, I was very happy with. Ann K. Schwader provided some lovely Nightland poems, and Michael Sisko wrote a Nightland story that I think almost out-weirds Hodgson in some ways. And Patrick, I think you were the other person who contributed a story primarily in the Nightland area, sort of a precursor.
Mm-hmm. So, my introduction to Hodgson actually is my introduction to a lot of fiction when I was growing up. So those of you who don't know me, I have 10 siblings. I'm the second youngest of 11 kids. And every night my mom would read for 20 minutes to a half an hour every single day after dinner. So we would eat dinner and then she would read. That's how I originally read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, things like that. But then we would also have some of my older brothers would pick stuff, and Hodgson came into it. So I was listening to the Nightlands when I'm like 7, 8 years old. This probably explains a lot about where my brain went. So it was something that it's something I grew up with, is just weird fiction, just Lovecraft and Hodgson and Ambrose Bierce and things like that. Which a lot of it I didn't remember who wrote it, but pieces of it stuck with me. So I've always had this love for just the weird and unexplainable. And with Hodgson, the Nightlands itself, growing up and becoming a physicist, I realized that the premise behind it of the sun dying out and everything is nonsense. But it always still, if it wasn't, it intrigued me as to if it wasn't nonsense, then where did this stuff come from? And I always appreciated his complete willingness to not explain anything. I love that. So I've got just a couple of paragraphs from one of my stories, which is probably thousands of years after now and thousands of years before the Nightlands. Garen frowned. "Why did you move me?" Yali clicked on a flashlight and shone it in one eye, then the other, before answering. "Pardon?" "Last night, after my final medications, I can only assume I was sedated without my consent. You moved me to another identical room. I'd like to know why." "Don't you think that sounds a little paranoid?" He nodded, as best he could in the brace securing his neck. "Oh yes, if it weren't true, it would be devastatingly paranoid. What a ridiculous effort to trick a man that he's in the same room when he's not. One might consider the endgame of such a crazy scheme." Yali frowned her psychiatrist's frown and used her finger to scribble into her tablet. "How do you know you've been moved?" His heart, his very soul, wanted nothing more than to run headlong into the gash, to join them in the beyond. It pulled at him literally, tugging his mind ever closer to its embrace with every agonizing moment. He could have pinpointed its location across the universe, much less through a few stories of plascrete and ceramic composite. He looked at the ceiling toward it and tried not to cry. She scribbled further. "You know where it is?" "Of course I do. How could I not?" There you go.
Thank you, Patrick. Wonderful. So it was interesting to see so many different takes on the Nightland in particular, but on just in general on Hodgson's ideas and themes. I was really hoping that people would bring contemporary takes to his ideas, because they always struck me, and I'll open this question to everybody who's on tonight. A lot of the notions, the fantastical notions in particular in Hodgson's work, have struck me as sort of ahead of their time. As an example, the Ghost Pirates in particular seems to hint at sort of, what we would call today a multiverse sort of existence. There's hints of physics behind the supernatural in that story, and I think that applies to House on the Borderland in some ways and some others. So I don't know if I'd be curious to hear if other people have the same impression when they read Hodgson, that he was ahead of his time, perhaps.
It certainly made me go to a multi-dimensional thing in what I wrote, but that's like, my brain loves to do that.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I think that there's this air of plausibility to his absolute weirdness that is really intriguing and charming and interesting, because he presents things not as if it's like, oh, it's not ghosts, it's not something that we all recognize as supernatural. It's just something different, and it's not necessarily explained, but it's something that maybe if we knew a little more, we could understand. And I've always appreciated that.
I agree.
Paradoxically, that is why I think he is actually writing absolutely of his time.
You mean the lack of explanation or
No,
understanding?
infinite possibility,
Okay.
change.
Yeah, well, the early 20th century was certainly an era of seismic change in a lot of places.
And I think in many, I suspect that's why he's becoming so relevant now again. That sense of upheaval.
All right. All right. Well, I know we're coming up on our first break when some of the folks will joining us will have to depart and others will be coming in. So I know, Todd, you're going to be one of the people jumping out. So why don't we go, and this gives us good opportunity to switch gears a little bit, because you did not look to the Nightland. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your inspiration and approach?
It's more of a confession, really. I am a tourist when it comes to Hodgson. I know very little. All I knew was House on the Borderland, which I had attempted to read when I was a teenager, and naturally hit the wall there. And I revisited it in preparation for this story, and came to the conclusion that this guy's possibly too fucking weird. And so with that in mind, I tried to envision something like that was contemporary, but also in the, I wanted to write something in the context of the dark web and, podcast and influencer culture. And then House on the Borderland just kind of seemed like this, it's this space in between. It's almost like a liminal structure or in a liminal area where things tend to overlap, and some weird things collect and wash upon the shore that don't really belong. And that's what led me to write my story, The Little House on the Borderland. I tried to work Michael Landon into this somehow, but that just didn't happen. So I'm going to read 16 lines because we don't have a lot of time. The setup that you need to know is that there's an influencer who has been shown a link on the dark web where he can buy a house called The Little House on the Borderland. And this scene, the setup for this these two paragraphs I'm going to read is that he and his assistant are arguing about how dangerous this is. Maybe, but this is like really bad. We usually have things delivered to a dead drop, but to go to them, you're asking for trouble. She had a point. Everything on the dark web required an extra level of anonymity, which worked both ways. Last Redoubt was an alternative to the more famous and now compromised site on the dark web known as Silk Road. If one wanted to procure such items as illegal drugs, sex slaves, untraceable weapons, and other illicit goods and services, Silk Road was the place to go. If one wanted another layer of protection from the FBI or other governments, and more likely something less common than a hitman for hire or a dose of fentanyl, Last Redoubt would satisfy those needs. Nightland LLC had purchased its share of strange items over the years, from Dybbuk boxes and haunted dolls to an alleged piece of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 and a clown. The latter was a grotesquely tall, gaunt man in a dirty clown costume who lingered outside the drop point, harassing passersby before someone called the cops. Janine had refused to approach him, and for good reason. He just stood there on the corner, picking his teeth with a knife and honking a horn. 2 weeks later, he'd been arrested for the murder of a minor. I'm going to stop there. I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, that's one of the creepier moments in your story, full of
Thank
creepy
you.
moments.
I should add that this story is easily the weirdest thing I've ever written to date. So
we have a really on point comment from Teel James Glenn that, if you had worked Michael Landon into that, we're talking Laura Ingalls really well.
All right, Teel wins. Teel wins tonight. Good job.
But thank you for. Yeah, I know you're leaving us in a terrible spot. Oops, hold on. There we go. Lee Murray says no. Don't stop there.
Well, if you want to find out what happens next, you have to buy the book.
Well, Lee is in the book, so she'll be getting a copy of the book.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you very much for reading. And I did, that was kind of what I was hoping for, at least for some stories, was that Hodgson through a contemporary lens, and the social media influencer, the dark web stuff, I thought was really an interesting approach to his concepts.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes before some of our group is going to step out, and I just want to make sure that we get a chance for those of you who are going to be jumping off, just tell people where they can find more about your work or where they can find your books. Aaron, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, thank you for today. It's been really, really terrific. I just have to say, damn, you're all so talented. It's good. It's really, really good. You can find me online. I am very easily Googleable, and I'm on X or Twitter or whatever we call it still, Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, on the side of toilet stalls, wherever you want to find me, there is a way. So please feel free to touch base. I love interacting with friends and new readers anytime. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this.
All right. Andy, how about you?
Oh, yeah, you can find me at my website, theandydavidson.com. There's links there to all the social stuff and books and everything else. So thanks for doing this, Jim.
Thank you for coming on and talking and reading. Much appreciated. Patrick, I think you're going to be signing off soon, so
I will. It's past my bedtime. So I'm the only Patrick Freivald on the planet. I'm easy to find. Just Google Patrick Freivald and you'll find me. Just make sure it's EI instead of IE. So I've got a short story collection and lots of novels and things. And I hope most of it's pretty fun. Thank you very much, Jim, for having me here and for having me as part of the anthology.
Thank you. All right. So, Todd?
I am not the only Todd Kiesling on the planet, but I'm the only one that writes horror fiction to my knowledge. So you can find me at toddkiesling.com. I'm on most socials except for Threads. And yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for buying my weird ass story, Jim.
Weird ass is good. Yeah. I was kind of amused at your comment that Hodgson might be too weird for you.
Kind of, yeah.
So, all right. Well, Aaron, Todd, Patrick, and Andy, thanks so much for joining us. And we're going to continue on with some of our other contributors tonight. And we'll have a few jumping in shortly. So those of you who are scheduled to come on I think you can go ahead and join us. Click the link and come on board anytime. Bye, Aaron. Thanks again. All right. And in the meantime, I think, why don't we go to Pete and Sal to talk about their story. And the event, is it the events at Apoca Station, or the event? I can't remember. I have to look now. Oh my gosh. I'm a terrible editor. The events. Yeah, thank you. At Apoca Station.
Yeah. So,
we went on a train trip.
yeah.
That's what happened.
and we got left at a station. I'm dead serious. We were coming back from Providence and by train just after the pandemic, when air travel was really unreliable, like they were canceling every other flight. So we had to go to Providence. So we took a train. We came back by train, and we got really, really friendly with our conductor. And
okay, so the long and short of it is this: on the way up, we took the coach, which means we sat in a chair for 24 hours, and that was a special time. We had a very, it's like an endurance. It's like running a marathon almost
with the worst people in the world.
So on the way back, we decided we'll get the sleeper coach. Why not? And that's such a better experience. If you're going to take the train, get the sleeper car, guys. Everybody, listen to us now when we say this to you, because yes, the treatment you get is by far better. And as a result, we were able to get off the train when we hit a spur station, which means the train kicks off and goes west across the state for like an hour or two, and then comes back again the other way. And so we'd asked when we were in coach if we could get off the train. And they said, no, absolutely not. Stay in your seat. Pete then asked I will call her car mother, because she took very good care of us. Her name was Ash, and she makes an appearance in the story. We promised we'd put her in the story because she was so nice to us. So she asked if we wanted anything, and we asked if we could get off and get lunch. And she said, let me ask the conductor. So she went out of her way to find out for us, and she comes back and says, absolutely, you can get off the train. To which Peter says, oh, no, I changed our mind. We don't want to get off. So we were then summarily thrown off the train and said, be back here at this time and we will pick you up. And so that started off our adventure in Apoca Station.
Yeah.
Pete?
And then what happened was we got a phone call from our conductor, and they said that they had to go back they were halfway to us, and then they had to go back and drop off passengers who were causing a problem. And it turns out some guy in coach started beating up his girlfriend. So they had to,
but which we were not surprised at all, because that is coach life. That's coach life.
So, but anyway, this story, this actual event, forms the basis for
the weirdness that follows in our story.
Yeah.
That we wrote.
Yeah. So,
so our story is about two people, a male and a female, that travel looking for books and such, and they're on their way back home, and one of the two detrains and has an adventure, and Pete's going to read something to you now from that.
But this is after she realized she's going to spend the night on the platform. It was but a moment later that I heard something large and heavy shuffling about the far end of the station platform, rummaging through the accumulated leaves and trash. It made a curious snuffling sound, and its feet clicked as they walked on the poured concrete. As I listened, there seemed to be far too many feet to be just one animal, and so I concluded there must have been at least two, if not more, making their way toward me. Inevitably, the scrounging, snuffling creatures were, it seemed, just feet from my hiding spot. And as I watched, wisps of hot breath came swirling through the rapidly cooling night air. They were so very close, and I could smell the mephitic stink of musk and garbage that exuded from their bodies. I clamped a hand to my mouth and prepared to run and fight if need be. But just then there was a snort of surprise, and the creatures seemed to skitter away in the direction they had come. Cautiously, I peeked from my hidey hole to see what beasts I had just avoided. To my surprise, it was not a pair of bears, but rather something completely different, something both fascinating and revolting. It was the size of a dog and covered in a sickly pale skin pocked with thick gray bristles and occasional splotches of sickly pink. Its head was not in any manner ursine, but was instead reminiscent of something porcine, particularly of the Indonesian barbarossa, with its small ears, oversized curling tusk, and beady crimson eyes. But as strange and wondrous as this pale monstrosity was, the most terrible thing about it was the 8 spindly legs that ended in small clawed hooves. It danced away from me on those queerly numbered appendages. I had mistaken the sound of those as coming from multiple animals, rather than a single monstrous individual. And we'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much, Pete and Sal. And it's funny. I was just as I was thinking, remembering reading the story for the first time, and that moment where it tips into the really bizarre things that are to come. We got a comment in the chat, which I thought was hilarious. Great description. Pushes dinner to one side. But I think it's fascinating that this was based on, for me, that it was based on a real experience, because I didn't know that this spur line railroad process existed.
Yeah, it runs in Florida. It runs from Lakeland to Tampa and back.
Okay.
So it's about a 2.5-hour round trip. So, we took the train from West Palm Beach up to New York, and then and so you get to stop in Lakeland, and then you can take the train west to Tampa, and then it comes back and it stops at Lakeland again. So it's like weird when you look at the schedule. There's 2 stops in Lakeland, Florida.
Right.
And the really crazy thing is it doesn't turn around. It just goes straight back. And then when you're riding in coach, you have to go both ways. So everything's in reverse out the window. And
it just goes backwards. Yeah.
Correct, yeah.
And I mean, that seems so tailor-made for a weird story.
Yeah, we have plans. There was a lot of weird stuff that happened. Like the train that left 24 hours before us, the same train was delayed by over 36 hours.
We passed it.
We passed that train on our way.
Okay.
So
doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
but it happened. Yeah. Yeah. So there are things that we still want to milk out of this train ride, and we kind of want to do another one just to see what the hell happens.
We didn't even get to talk about how we got to go into the back. We're not supposed to talk about this, but yeah, they let us go into the backpack. I got to see out the back door where you're not supposed to go.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Well, that's more fodder for a story.
Yeah.
Right there. You got to see out the door you're not supposed to see out.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my train experience was on a commuter rail on the Long Island Railroad, and I can tell you that there were some commutes that felt like they were 24 hours in coach.
Yeah.
So I think the record was 6 hours stuck on a train for me, but for like a 45-minute trip.
Oh yeah. We've been there. We got stuck on I-95 going to our airport, which is only like an hour away, for 3 hours.
Oh yeah.
And everything.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm veering off topic here into potentially a future anthology of stuck in traffic horror. But I want to give a shout out to those who have just joined us. So Megan Arcuri has signed on, Robert E. Waters, Teel James Glenn, and Maxwell Ian Gold. So thank you all for jumping on to join us for this. And I think before we continue on, we're going to go to, I'm trying to think now, the events at Apoca Station really sort of veer into Hodgson-esque territory without, I guess it's more Nightlandish than Borderlandish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I when we were writing it, I drew from Nightland, a little bit of Borderland, and the whole kind of premise of the voice behind the door is the voice in the night.
Yeah. And what we haven't delved into yet are Hodgson's nautical horrors. So I think, Lauren, if you'd like to, I know you have, you took a great approach to the terrors of the sea.
Oh, I'm so excited about this. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jim, for organizing us. I grew up in Rhode Island, so I spent a lot of time along that liminal space of the shoreline. I was fishing by myself I was single digits, and things like pulling up my first sea robin, which if you don't know what that is, it's like the missing link of fish that has fingers and it croaks. And I remember being by myself and having to try to remove the hook from that. You think it's going to speak. And reading, the Sargasso Sea stories, the Night Oceans, Thing in the Weeds, The Mystery of the Derelict. I love these stories. They really spoke to me. And all those hours spent just trying to see into the water, So I'll be reading from my historical horror, Hangman's Coming. And that's also inspired by the boats of the Glen Carrig. I always loved nautical adventures where resounding wails and a putrid stench precedes an uncharted horror. Now, my story is set in 1891, and I chose that particular year for a reason. I found a gap in my learning, really, and began to investigate what was America's largest recorded single-mass lynching in our history. 11 Italian immigrants were murdered in New Orleans, and I was never taught about this event in school. And as I began to research it, I began to think about my ancestry and how some of my ancestors came through New Orleans around that time, and that they handed down stories about how frightening it was that they were afraid to eat the food on board, for example, when they came by ship. And they also didn't linger in New Orleans. They went straight to New York City or Chicago. So it kind of filled in a gap researching this story. So my story opens, I have months later, I set the story down, and we're in the weed-choked Sargasso Sea. A European immigration ship, the SS Algiers, sits dead in the water. The weed has choked the props. During the night, as thunder rolls in the darkness, and with each flash of lightning, a vision appears to 4 of the passengers who stand gazing on deck, already frightened of what awaits them in America. A hulk, an old ship from a forgotten time. Then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. A score of terrible sounds rippled over the Black Sea. Layers of cries and twisted moans shatter the air. Mi sento male. Agata felt sick. What was that? Are we moving? Maria clung to her sister Grazia's arm. I did not think we were moving. We're not moving, Frank said, holding his raven. It's moving toward us. Grazia's fingers tightened around the rail. Again, a flash, and the hulk was closer, and the smell, like a wet, gray eruption of decay, peppered the air. With just enough moonlight now, the hulk emerged from the shadows and grew into its stature as a battered early-century sailing bark. It cut through the current without wind or sail. Of its 3 masts, the foremast and rear mizzen were splintered and half gone. From the middle mast, objects swung like fruit, and they were not tattered sails. The rigging and shrouds supporting that mast gleamed wet in the gloom, and all around where the ship met, the water of fog boiled like steam. The ship moved at speed, not just toward the SS Algiers, but the hulk's body itself was writhing with movement, like bugs, sea lice, the skin of a horse, shaking off flies. All 4 of the passengers stood, staring at its approach, and Grazia's eyes burned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
And one of the fun things for me is hearing these words read by all of you, read by the authors. I hear them in my head in a certain way, and I like to hear the original interpretation. So, did you do much research for your story?
Yes, a lot. I actually, when this submission appeared, as you know, I started to research, and I think I researched for 6 months. I just kind of funneled into reading mastheads of ship passenger lists, all of those. That you can find everything online. So Frank's name he was an American that went and worked in Europe as a stockman and came home, and he was writing in in the steerage. So I wondered what happened for him. And I just began putting pieces together, and also included stories my family had handed down, like when the immigrants showed up, they had to be careful not to trade their currency for what people would offer them, claiming it was American money, and it would be something like a cigar band. So there was a lot of conning and a lot of vulnerability for immigrants at the time as well. So I did a lot of research and kind of got buried for a little while because I wanted to include so much, but it's a fascinating place to go.
That was one of the details that hit me or struck me as the most shocking. And it's such a small thing as the cigar band scam. I just had never heard of that, and was, you think, every way people can cheat other people, and then you learn about a new way that they were doing over 100 years ago.
Yes, that was my grandmother told me about that, because they were warned, especially in the West Village and the Harlem Italian community. People were vulnerable, and they were new, and they didn't speak the language. They were leaving Italy when it was a tough time. The farms were drying out, and just a big time of change again. And then they weren't welcome in the South at all. And to read that and to see all those photographs and know that that was just completely left out of all the education that we had surprised me. I didn't know.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Tim, you had a very different take on sort of the nautical aspects of Hodgson's horror stories. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yours?
Well, one of the things that I find myself returning to kind of time again in my work is that when I was 9, I almost drowned. And it didn't last very long. It's like 2-3 minutes of your life. But it's echoed through my life, all my life. And I also have a fascination with water, like a lot of people do. That just, what is beneath. And it's like a perfect metaphor for weird and cosmic fiction in a lot of ways, because you have what looks like, if the water's still, you have what looks like a solid plane, but it's not. I mean, it's so permeable, and you could fall in and be swallowed by this world. That world, whatever's in there, can come up to you, and you just never know. You never know what's there. And there's that mystery to it. And when I was just kind of, grazing through Hodgson's stories, trying to think, what could I write for the anthology? I was determined not to write a water story because I've written so many. But what appealed to me in his various stories was there was a real sense of loneliness, and it had to come from him, like being on deck at night, because that shows up in his stories. But that kind of affected me. I like that real well. And I also just in general like the fact that he just doesn't seem to be without progenitor. I mean, his stuff is just, it is weird fiction in its truest form. It doesn't ape Lovecraft. It doesn't do anything else. So at any rate, I decided to go ahead and try to do another drowning story and try to make it a different kind of drowning story, Hodgsonian story. So I'll read for you just the first couple paragraphs of All That Lies Below. This, Jacob Reed thought to himself, was the worst idea I've ever had. He sat in the stern of an aluminum motorboat, upper body turned sideways, left hand on the tiller, right on the throttle, dressed in t-shirt, shorts, sneakers, and an orange life jacket. He'd just stopped the motor, but he hadn't tossed the anchor overboard to keep the boat in place yet. There was a slight breeze blowing, and the boat was slowly drifting to the left. Port, he reminded himself. Left is port. The motion was gentle, and someone else might have found it soothing. Jacob, however, felt nauseated. It was warm and sunny this afternoon, only a few white clouds in the sky, a beautiful day, but he trembled as if it were a winter midnight. Aaron thrashing in the water, shouting to be heard over the engine's roar. Dad sitting in the stern, completely oblivious to what's just happened, gripping the tiller with one hand and swigging a beer with the other, the boat racing across the lake, leaving Aaron behind. Jacob shouting, "Go back, go back." Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. So I think one of the things that worked so well for me about your story is how it captured a lot of what you were talking about Hodgson's naval stories about the isolation, the staring out at the sea, but his stories are generally on a broader scale. They're ships, they're full of people, or they're lifeboats full of people. There's more happening, and you somehow captured all of the essence of those stories, but boiled it down to a very small and personal kind of experience story.
Well, good.
So anyway, that was what I liked about it.
If I had ever been on a cruise, maybe I had something, to draw on from my own life. But, that aluminum boat was the one my dad had that would take us on the lake. And, the character's brother falls out of the water, just the boat into the water and disappears and is never found. And, I've fallen out of a boat before. I was found. I'm right here. But enough of the stuff that I could pull out of my own life. I started off college as an acting major, and it's one of the things they taught us was that if you could find anything in your life that had the same basic kind of emotion, like if you felt loneliness at any time in your life, you could draw on that to infuse a character with loneliness. It's not method acting, but it's a way you can connect to that. And so I often look for personal things like that, and so I can connect to stories, even if no one's ever going to know but me. It's a personal kind of thing.
And just to prove there's always a critic in the crowd, here from Authortunities, what I didn't like about Tim's story is when he stopped reading.
Oh, well. Thanks.
So, Tim, thank you so much. And I think what I'd like to do is jump to one of Hodgson's earliest stories. In fact, it was his first published story, The Goddess of Death, published in 1904. It's a very particular kind of story. And I don't want to say too much about it. It's one of those stories that seems supernatural, but isn't entirely, or isn't really supernatural at the end, sort of, the kind of Scooby-Doo ghost story that was so popular around the time that Hodgson was writing, and to some extent is still popular today, I think, although we seem to have more of a preference for actual supernatural explanations. But this actually tied into a couple of stories, a poem and a story in the book. And so, Linda, I thought you might be able to talk a little bit about what you saw in that story that inspired your poem.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted. So, Jim, you always have these anthologies based on things that I did not know. I was a tourist myself, like Aaron said earlier. But I'm always in, because somehow I read the stuff and something so different comes out. And I started reading his work, and then I came across something about The Goddess of Death being the first published story. And I was like, oh, Goddess of Death, let's do that. Let's go read that one. And I did read it. And because I write so organically, I was just waiting for something to catch. And you may remember in a previous anthology, I was like, I got nothing. Then all of a sudden I had everything. So anyway, that's kind of what happened with this story. It's a wonderful, it ran like a movie in my head, and I just loved it. And then at the end, the last line, there's a mention of the Goddess of Death, and all of a sudden the poem came. And I always like to take a different point of view. So I took the point of view of the Goddess of Death. Imagine that. And so I'm going to read the poem, because I really can't read half a poem, and it's only 2 minutes. So, and I also, I think I mentioned earlier, I was reading some of his stuff, and I kept going into like a multi-dimensional taste for something. So what I loved about this story is the logic seems to be running you through the story versus just, the supernatural possibilities. And I really like that tension. So my poem is called Death and the Goddess Yet Seen. Ah, you clever, clever human animal, using logic in your monkey brain, figuring it all out, feeling safe as bullets made one of my mightiest bleed. Did you notice the slight smile under the white mask, his death mask? You thought the lake washed away blood released from holes you made, but not seen in those last moments my many arms embracing him, I lapping the outflowing essence, giving life eternal for his devotion. Tonight, when celebrations are done, wine glasses empty, you stumble in the bedroom, wondering at dainty wet footprints, hoping a villager wants to lay with you. You hero, you protector of mere mortals. For you, gods and goddesses live in the realm of superstition, while you fake belief in the garden, the fall from grace. I am your serpent, uncoiling in shadows of your naked deception, revealing the true duality of logic. But what of things yet seen? You won't live to see humans prove our existence in other dimensions. But as I feast on your soul, tightening reason around your neck slowly, we will become one. You will see all. So that's Death and the Goddess Yet Seen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. I don't know. You always make me do something like that, Jim, with this. And I'm like, when I finished it, I was like, holy crap, what?
Well,
So I
I'll assume
appreciate
that's a
that
good thing.
about you. Yes. No,
Okay,
I always
good.
appreciate the fact that you always give me some weird stuff I haven't seen before, and then I write weird stuff. So it's all good.
Very cool. Well, one of the goals I had with this anthology was to get more people to read Hodgson, and it seems like I've already had some success with that.
No doubts. No
Yeah.
doubts at all. I read a lot of, and I found a place on YouTube where they Telltale Stories or something where they read them to you. I love being read to. So
Oh, that's cool. I haven't seen that one. Do they have Hodgson stories there?
yeah, they start off with the Goddess of Death, and they do all the stories. This guy reading it is like falling in love with him, what I get. So I just like put it on like radio.
That's cool. I'll have to check that out. I have listened to a couple of the audiobooks when I needed to revisit the Nightland or House on the Borderland, just because they are dense reading, and if you have to get to something quickly, it's a little easier to listen to it. Very cool. Well, thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Appreciate.
And I think Robert, I'd like to talk to you now. So I think your story also looked to the Goddess of Death for some inspiration. And if you can tell us a little bit about what caught your interest in that and how you approached it, that would be great.
Yeah. My story in the anthology is called Our Lady of Morocco. And it was one of the first stories that I read in one of the volumes of Hodgson's work that I read, and I was immediately hooked to it. I thought it was great, and like James says, it's a bit of a it's got a little bit of supernatural, but not quite as much. And I thought it was just a really fantastic story. And then, of course, I continue to read other stories, but I kept coming back to that one and thinking about how I could write a story that might be an homage to his very first story published. And so I'll go ahead and read it. I'll read the first part. It won't take very long, I hope. And I just want to make a little mention that there is some foul language in the first part here. So just bear with me here. All right. So it's Our Lady of Morocco. Here we go. In the summer of 2020, I received an anxious message from Ashland Grace, an old college friend. He wanted me to attend him at his home in Virginia. Things are getting ugly here, Paul, he texted. I need your help. He didn't tell me what was getting ugly, which I found surprising. Being a history major from the University of Colorado, Ashland was always a stickler for detail. That summer saw the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and the rejuvenation of the Black Lives Matter movement due to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. Given Ashland's politically conservative views, which could sometimes border on crackpot conspiracy theories, I figured it was either one or both of those issues. Despite my misgivings about traveling across the country via aircraft, I agreed. Regardless of his political views, Ashland was a friend, and I have so few of those in my life. He picked me up at baggage claim at the Richmond International Airport. He wasn't wearing a mask. "I don't need no goddamn mask," he said to me with a hearty laugh, giving me a strong bear hug. "This whole COVID thing is a bunch of bullshit. Come on," he said, tossing the bag into his trunk bed and opening the passenger door. "Let's get going." "How are you, Ash?" I asked as he pulled away from the curb. It had been 6 years since I had last seen him. Your message was vague. What's going on? He paused, and I could always tell when he was anxious, nervous. His eyes watered, his face grew red, and he rubbed his cheeks vigorously. Since I'd last seen him, his light brown hair had grown long, and he sported a shaggy, unkempt beard with a touch of gray. He sighed deeply, with a hint of beer on his breath. "They want to take it away, Paul. They want to tear it down and take it away." "What?" "Captain Uriah Bridgeport's monument." I shook my head. "Not familiar with it." "It's Rivertown's only Confederate statue, and the SJW goons want to tear it down." I refrained from snapping back at him about the misplaced social justice warrior insult, sighed deeply as well, and said, "I appreciate you inviting me for a visit, Ash. It's good to see you again. But is it necessary to bring me all the way here from Denver just because of a statue?" He turned to me, stared for a good while, then pulled the truck over into the shoulder before we exited the airport. "Paul, there's more to it than just a statue." "Okay," I said, shrugging. "What else?" Ash stared through the windshield, his eyes glazed over as if he had seen a ghost. "There's been a murder." That's it.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
It's a very suspenseful point to stop at.
Yeah.
So now this story also digs into some interesting history, some of which was new to me. And I know you've written a fair amount of, would it be fair to say, alternate history or sort of historically based science fiction?
Yeah, more or less what I've written is I've written with Eric Flint and with Chuck Gannon some alternate history in the 1632 Ring of Fire series by Bain, published by Bain. But I did research a lot of this Civil War. See, part of the story later on in the story is about the Civil War. There's actual historical facts in there about the Union coming up the peninsula campaign up into Virginia, and it was basically the 7 days battle. It's about later on, once the Civil War ends, that these statues, a lot of the Southern statues that were erected, oftentimes were put in there in order to intimidate African Americans. Many of them were, not all, but many of them were, and so that was one of the reasons why they wanted to take Uriah Bridgeport's statue down. So that's part of the reason. So
you did a fair amount of research for this particular story?
Oh yeah. And part of it is based on Morocco. Now the Morocco, they had units in the Civil War called Zouaves, and what they were is they actually wore Morocco style uniforms. They had like almost a red fez hat kind of things, and a lot of the different kinds of uniforms. And they were on both sides. They had them on the Union side, and they also had them on the Confederacy side. I did a pretty extensive research into that, in order to try to make it as clear as possible. And some of the units that were actually in the story were actually real units that were actually there during the 7 days battle.
And this is just all the historically based stuff. We're hardly even touching on all the Hodgsonian elements that people are going to find in this story.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, thank you so much, Robert.
You're welcome.
Teel, your story also is very steeped in history. I know we've talked about that a little bit, and do you want to give us some insight?
Okay. I have always been fascinated with dirigibles. And for those of you who don't know, that's a rigid airship. That's a lighter than airship that's held aloft by gas, either helium or hydrogen. And the Hindenburg being the one that's the most famous. Because Hodgson, the story that got me was his Boats of Glencarry, which are a bunch of guys stranded in lifeboats that drift into this really weird place. And Hodgson was very much into, it was about hierarchies in the naval order. It was about bullying. He had a real problem with authority figures, or they had a problem with him. And so I wanted to tell a story that evoked all of that, but I didn't really want to do another bunch of guys on a boat story. It seemed like that had been done. So it occurred to me that airships were indeed that. They were ships of the air. They ran with the same kind of hierarchies. They had the same kind of discipline. And with the German airships, because they had to use hydrogen, which was incredibly flammable, America would not sell them helium. And so they had to be very rigid and very strict about protocols about anything that would cause a spark. So I decided to write a story that was from the point of view of Helmut Eisner, who is a Jew, who is on the sister ship to the Hindenburg. Now, when the Nazis came to power, they took over the Air Corps, and they started to use the ships as propaganda tools. But there was an entire group of airmen that were basically sort of the civil servants of the air. These were guys that sailed the skies. And the Nazis tried to take them over. Helmut, being a Jew, was on the lower end of all this, but he was a skilled airman. So the story that I concocted was putting him in sort of the position of Hodgson as the lower guy in the totem pole, the abused guy who has an encounter with this liminal space on the ship. And if you want, I will start reading. My story is called Latitude Dark. And he has just woken up from a nightmare, hearing a loud boom. There was another boom. I had a sudden premonition of danger and raced down the corridor towards the open passenger lounge. I ran through the dining area, but encountered no one. There, I stopped, stunned, as I looked through the wide windows of the lounge, which showed gray darkness of enshrouding clouds. In those dark, amorphous shapes, I could see flashes of light that had to be lightning. That was very bad. I ran forward through the gondola, heading for the control room, but oddly encountered no one. When I pushed through the door into the control cabin, I stopped horrified. There was no one at the controls. I sprang to the wheel, but it had been lashed in place as if the officer of the watch had been called away momentarily. "Hello," I yelled. "Crew on deck." There was no response. I grabbed the speaking tube and yelled into it, "Emergency ahoy! Crew to the control room! Please respond. Is there anyone? Come to the control room." There was no response. I tried again for the same results. Outside, the gray clouds were roiling mass, seeming as solid as a mountainside. I still saw the flashes of light in the dark shapes and heard the rumbles of thunder. I felt a chill race up my back. What could have happened to everyone? I moved from the control room to the chart room, the radio room, then the galley. In the kitchen, I found the electric burner still on, stew in a large pot that was still bubbling. I turned it off and left the room, stumbling back to the lounge, now terrified. Is there anyone there? I was fully panicked now. I moved through the lounge, the black corridors, and through all the passenger staterooms, opening door after door to find no one. I ran all the way to the crew's quarters and the washrooms and the very back of the ship. Finally, I was at the back viewing window, hands pressed against the glass and trembling. I was alone. Alone. There was no one on the entire airship. Could they have abandoned for some horrible reason while I slept and not bothered to wake me? If so, what calamity could have possibly compelled the entire crew and passengers to leave the airship in the middle of the ocean? And how could they do so?
Thank you, Teel. Everyone was enjoying your accent.
What accent?
So very nice work. And a very interesting take on the sailing aspect of Hodgson's work to transport it to the air.
To me, the structure is exactly the same. It's captain, it's first officer, it's crewman, it's bosun's mate. It literally is airships, and which is one of the reasons why it's so popular to throw them into like the steampunk world, because it really is that kind of transition point. And then you add the political stuff to this, and the fact that Hodgson wanted to just be a good sailor and just got bullied constantly for it. I thought it fit into the socio-political aspect. And there really was a sister ship to the Hindenburg, which was absolutely the safest airship in the world. Hindenburg is the only one of those airships that ever had an accident. It was because the idiots painted it basically with explosives and then didn't want to admit it. The aluminum doping that they used had aluminum powder in it. It ignited just from static air. But they couldn't admit it because then it would make the Germans look bad.
Sounds like fodder for another story.
Oh, yeah. There are many.
Terrific. Well, Teel, thank you so much.
Okay.
One of the other stories that dips into history a little bit is Megan Arcuri's tale. So Megan, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your inspiration for the story and give us a little taste of it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for having me. One of the things my story point of entry here was the house on the borderland. And kind of like a lot of other people, I hadn't read much else. And one of the things that there were a lot of interesting things about it, but one of the things that kind of troubled me was that there was a character that was his sister, the main character's sister, and you hardly saw her, you hardly got her name. He's having all these crazy things happen to him with the hog people and just everything, and she's there, and all he cares about is the dog. And it's like, well, what happened to this woman? What was she doing the whole time? And and recently, I'm getting older, and I'm thinking about how sometimes women are, as they get older, they are ignored or they kind of disappear and people overlook them. And then just kind of concurrently, I had been reading about Edward Hopper, the artist. And one of the things, because I love his art, but as I was doing the research, one of the things that stood right out to me was his relationship with his wife, Josephine. They were fascinating, and she was an artist too. And they knew each other for a long time, but they never got married until they didn't get married to anybody. And then when they were both 40, they got married to each other, and they didn't have kids, and they were just kind of a picture of opposites. He was this real tall guy, and she was this short little woman, and he was this sort of stoic, puritanical man, and she was a firecracker of a person, and they had a very volatile relationship. And So sort of those three things kind of influenced me as I was thinking about this story. So and one of the other interesting things about the Hoppers is that Josephine was the model for all of Hopper's work that involved figures. So she's kind of always in his art, which I thought was interesting, but also gave up her own career in art to support him and to do his books and to book shows for him and things like that. So I thought it was interesting how she kind of, took a step back so that he could move forward. So the Hoppers are a big influence on the story that I wrote. And I'll read a little snippet now. I'm going to jump in toward the beginning. The only thing I guess you really need to know is that our protagonist has just, she's on the sidewalk in New York City. This guy didn't see her and he walked right into her, knocked her on her butt. She bit her lip. There was a little blood, little scrape and whatever. And so she's heading back to her apartment. And just the only other thing you need to know is that Marty is her husband. And the title of the story is Going, Going. I trudge up the steps, all 68 of them. They're a delight in the winter when we use more coal than usual. The metal bucket starts to get pretty heavy by step number 25. Our door is ajar, a peculiar green glow on the floor. When I push it open, I am not met with the usual mise en scène, our easels and brushes, the shabby kitchenette with two mismatched chairs, the bare throw rug speckled with paint. No, this is not my apartment at all. But when I turn to leave, the door behind me has disappeared. I am outside, a dirt path stretching out in front of me. It is peppered with knobby roots, lined with shrubs, thorny and angry. The evergreens and oaks seem to rise taller and taller, the sky nearly invisible. The scent of pine mixed with earth fills my nose, but it's tainted by a dank moldiness. Hello? It comes out as a muffled whisper. No birds chirp, no leaves rustle. My skin tingles, the eerie silence unnerving me. Hello? I say it again and again, but the louder I yell, the softer my voice becomes. Shocking. You've never been that quiet a day in your life. The familiar voice echoes in my head. Marty, where are you? His low, gravelly laugh surrounds me, making my gut rumble. He does not appear. I attempt to scream, but only a soft whisper comes out. Another laugh. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
So I recall when we did the event at Stanza a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that in the house on the borderland, the sister goes unnamed, but he makes a point of saying the dog's name several times.
Right, and references the dog, and it clearly loves this dog, which is great. I have a dog. I love my dog too, but yeah, I mean, he's a sister. She's in the house. She could have helped him. I don't know. It was interesting to me.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think we're going to go on to our last reader for tonight, Maxwell Ian Gold. And Max, if you'd like to give us a little bit of insight, your poem, Death Knocks Someday Soon, seems to touch on a lot of different elements of Hodgson. Was that intentional, or what were you thinking about when you wrote it?
Yeah, a little bit. I also just wanted to say thank you for putting this whole thing together. It's wonderful. I'll be honest, I didn't really read a lot of Hodgson before. I guess I wanted to know more about the poetry, any poetry that he did. It was actually very hard to find. There was only I wanted to get a print copy, and the only print copy of the lost poetry of William Hope Hodgson was from Tartarus Press, and it was several $100s. So I went to Kindle. But anyway, his poetry in my opinion, read a lot different than his fiction. It had almost a little bit of a Milton-esque kind of feel to it. It was very, he a lot of long clauses, and almost like he had his own way of speaking, his own language, similar to like what John Milton did as well. So I wanted to kind of echo that a little bit in Death Knocks, and he also just talked about death a lot in his poetry, and not in a he talks about death in his fiction too, but he talks about it in a more longing way in his poetry. So I'm just going to read the poem. It's called Death Knocks, Someday Soon. And it's divided into two sections. One is called The Other Side of Nowhere, and the other one is called Someday Soon. Crooked hands and wrinkled lips like rotten fruit will loose their grip on that other side of nowhere, where the sun never rises, never again, never to shine on broken seas with brittle galleons gliding o'er the purple waters that ruin sails full spread beneath the spectral glow of unknown stars, never to sing, but wither and fail, pieces of dying asphodel, blossoms broken, a stem smothered in salt, never to act as sentinel sentinel guiding the lost soul's fate through storm and gale, never to trumpet that final anthem whose soliloquies ring deep in the murky sinews when death knocks. Someday soon, yearning to touch iron hills colored with rust and decayed flora, where the old ships once made safe call to familiar ports, under lumbering towers of stone and light, too far from the rocks, too late to spy the ghosts of loved ones, pathetic mortality met with freckled, rocky backsides on the other side of nowhere, lined with poppies, thorns, and bones, tattered yarns swaying in the cold, dark air, humbled by the mass of eternity, heavy and fat, when death knocks. Someday soon, and the seas will rock no more, no waves to roil the hearts and hatred of men, no stars beneath the empty, gutted salt depths, no thunderclaps across bellicose nights that seize the bravest and stalwart souls, no hope within the fingers of the void betwixt graveyard and wood-rot barnacled flesh and nightmares when death knocks. Someday soon, the endless pitch-dark worries that clutched the breasts of those who stood by the iron hills, waiting for a call from beyond the shore, only to expect a lingering whisper or praise by vague creatures floating amidst the purple fog of the night, waiting for the possibility that shadows might not dance without hallucinations of dead ships to reveal the corpse of hope. No, the return of a light. Waiting for the realization that none of it will matter in the end, when the earth is covered in salt, waiting for the day when death knocks. Someday soon, the music swirling in foam and fervor of pits too tenebrous, too despicable to be named, belching fire, lightning, and truth, as if wrought by gods themselves, too awful to worship, and too beautiful to be captured by a stroke of pen, too late, when I realize nothing else, except the crooked hands and wrinkled lips, like rotten fruit, too late, they come from the other side of nowhere. They come for me when death knocks.
Thank you, Max. Wonderful.
Clapping.
So it's interesting that it was hard to find Hodgson's poetry. I guess is the Tartarus edition the only one in print of his poetry?
That was the only print one that I could find, and I'll just read like one. It's hard to read one line, but just for example, like one of the lines, because if you read like Milton or any of those kind of those poets, it's not just one line. It's one line that leads to another clause, and then another clause references that. So it's very like he says, "O death, thou many-guised one, who art to this heart terror, and to that one rest, who soothest as with So it doesn't sound like William Hope Hodgson normally, and I was just very intrigued by that because I was like, this doesn't sound like Night on the Borderlands or anything like that. So I wanted to try and like capture that very almost like mourning, if you will.
Well, and it's interesting. I have to admit that I haven't really read much of his poetry, but he was such a stylistic. I don't know almost he would change styles from series to series, book to book. He tried on so many different ways of approaching stories that it's not surprising to hear his poetry reads yet, and even differently.
Well, and he does things in it like he'll and I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with every little bit in his fiction, but like in a lot of his poetry, like there are particular, like he does particular capitalizations, like one or death or desolation. So you'll find those particular entities or reasons are capitalized randomly. Well, I don't know if they're random, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, they're not grammatically driven.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you all so much for giving us some behind the scenes information about your pieces. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts they'd like to share about Hodgson?
The only thing I would say is I came into Hodgson vaguely through Carnacki, and like Max said, he had so many faces. It literally was like, he would try something for a while and then say, nah, I'll go over here and do something completely different. I have a feeling if he kept going, he would have ended up writing ranch romances or something just completely different from what he'd done at that point. Because you could divide it, you could say, these 6 things are this, but these 6 things are so completely different. If you put a different name on it, you wouldn't know it was the same writer. He did that with his life, though. He had like 6 different phases of existence.
Yeah. He did jump around entrepreneurially, trying to find different ways to make a living.
So one of the things that I want to talk about is we have this problem in weird fiction in that a lot of readers aren't really well read, and they haven't read Hodgson, and when they read some piece that's cosmic horror, they say, "Oh, that's so Lovecraftian," and I have to always stop and say, "No, it's not Lovecraftian. It's Hodgsonian." There's a film out a few years ago called Sea Fever about a woman on a ship that gets stuck, surrounded by tendrils, and people are slowly infected by the sea beast. And it is absolutely just a rewrite of the voice in the night. And everybody's, "Oh, this is a great Lovecraftian movie." And it's like, no, it's not. We don't have a language that it really works for us to explain where our cosmic horror sources come from.
He didn't have weird tales as a publicity agenda,
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, and I think with this anthology and also with the previous anthology I edited for Hippocampus, Under Twin Suns, Alternate Histories of the Yellow Sign, one of my hopes was that it would sort of broaden the road a little in cosmic horror and weird fiction to get around Lovecraft. And it's nothing against that material. I've written quite a lot of Lovecraftian horror myself, and there's a lot of great material written in that mode. But I think there's so much more there that we could tap into and look at. So I will admit that I was surprised when I started this project, just how many even just horror readers were not really aware of Hodgson. And I think his books were out of print really for quite a long time and hard to find. And I know I talk about this in my introduction a little bit, but my first real exposure to Hodgson was the graphic novel adaptation of The House on the Borderland by Simon Revelstoke and Richard Corbin that was published by Vertigo Comics. And I read that and was just immediately hooked and had to read more by that, by the source author. But it took me quite a while to find a copy of House on the Borderland. Couldn't find it at the bookstore. Couldn't find it at used bookstores. This was before, Project Gutenberg and all of those great sources.
Even the Nightshade reprints are really difficult to find now, and that was supposed to put everything back into print.
Actually, I spent a fair amount of time collecting a full set of those as I was working on this.
I was just at Barnes and Noble 3 days ago, and saw House of the Borderlands on the shelf, plus other Hodgson books just right there for people to get.
Cool.
I mean, that's the thing I love about what you're doing, Jim, with this anthology, the previous one, is that you are like reintroducing another dimension of weird writing, not just to like me, but to people who are reading it. And everyone in this anthology and the one before that, they do different ways and approaches to reflect the impact that it's made. So you really are giving a second life to these authors, and I think it's wonderful.
Well, thank you, Linda. I hope it plays out for readers, and that there's increased interest in Hodgson and Chambers.
I think in a way I remember in the 80s there was a big movement for before Holmes, and these books came out with the rivals of Sherlock Holmes, and people suddenly realized he wasn't alone and isolated. And I think this is doing that for weird fiction. Before Lovecraft, there were a lot, and this, this has got a modern spin on it that might pull more people in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that we're sort of in this phase of rediscovering some of the the earliest and most influential but forgotten horror and weird fiction. I know Hippocampus has done a great job publishing collections of authors who have been otherwise sort of overlooked. And just a few years ago, I think it was, Lisa Morton and Leslie Klinger edited 2 volumes of Weird Women. So it's basically weird fiction from this same era, written by women that had largely been unreprinted, and so they're really valuable records for what who was writing what at that time. Well, I think we're running a little long, and I don't want to keep everybody. I know I've kept some of you on here for quite a while, and I'm grateful for your time and your support for the project, and certainly for your stories and poems. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to tell us where we can find out more about you and your books. And we'll start just going by the order on my screen. Tim, if you don't mind going first, we'll start with you.
I think I finally unmuted myself.
There we go.
You can find me you can find me on all the socials, and you can also just go to my website, which is timwagner.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And you have some really cool stuff. You've had a lot of books coming out recently too, haven't you, that people should be looking for?
Sure. I did the novelization of Terrifier 2 and the of X.
Right. Kyla.
Oh, if you're curious, then KylaWard.com will probably do the trick. Just like to mention, I'm very proud to also have a story in another anthology that has been released recently, and that's Discontinue If Death Ensues. Tales from the Tipping Point. So.
I believe another Where the Silent Ones Watch contributor is part of that also, Lee Murray.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And our regular Galactic Terrors co-host, Carol Geisander, is also an editor and contributor for that.
All the sisters of foreboding are there.
Yes, I saw that you now actually have an official T-shirt too, and I'm terrified. Excellent. Thank you. Lauren.
Great, thank you. You can find me on the socials, Facebook Insta tend to be the two I use the most. I've got a website called BrisbaneWriters.com. It's because I run a writing kind of community and workshop school, and I do kind of latch onto that with my personal page just to keep everything in one place. The thing I'm most excited about is that Krista Carmen and I released Monsters in the Mills. We co-edited another series of Rhode Island stories, and it's all about the mills, and in a contemporary sense, a historic sense. There's an introduction by Faye Ringel, and it's just fantastic. So I'm really proud of that. Thank you.
Megan.
Yes, I'm also on the socials, mostly Facebook and Instagram, sometimes X, but who knows what's happening with that platform. But I'm also at meganrcurie.com. And I have another story in an anthology coming out soon, the Dark Spores anthology, and Carol Geisander is part of that as well. So she's everywhere, and deservedly so. And I'm excited to be part of that anthology as well.
Robert.
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. My name is actually just Robert Waters, not Robert E. Waters. I also have a roberternestwaters.com. You can find me there. You can most of my stuff is listed on there. You can find a lot of my novels and some of the anthologies on Amazon and also in Barnes and Nobles as well. And I've been writing cryptid stories, novellas, for eSpec books. The ones that I've written is Eyes of the Wolf, Water Music, and the next one that's planning to come out probably next year will be called Ghost of the Dawnlands. And it's basically about Native American cryptids, supernatural beings, characters, creatures. So that's where you can find me. And like I said, I have a website, roberternestwaters.com.
Thank you, Robert. Teel.
Hi, I'm on the socials, mostly Facebook. I sort of live on it, and X. And I also have a story in Dark Spores and in An Assembly of Monsters, which is coming out from eSpec Books. And I'm really proud of the fact that I've got a first of a novel series called Not Born of Woman, Paradise Investigations, coming out in November from Macabre Inc. Books. And I have a really ancient website that needs to be rebuilt called theurbanswashbuckler.com. But you can find me there. I'm everywhere.
Terrific. Pete and Sal.
So I'm on Facebook and only Facebook, only because I need to be for work, because I get half my jobs through Facebook. So, and Sal, you are
only on Instagram, and I really don't do anything with that. Just I hate social media. I'll be honest with you guys.
And then we published a couple. So Sal and I just started writing together. What, a year and a half ago?
Yeah. That.
So in that time, we've published 3 or 4 stories, including in Murder Mythos Magic from PS Publishing, and Nosferatu Unbound, which just came out back at the same time as this book. So it's only been out for a couple weeks.
Very cool.
We're very happy with that.
Very good timing with the new Nosferatu movie coming.
Yes, we're very pleased with that.
Yeah, it was a good story.
All right, thank you, Linda.
Yeah, yes, I'm so I love hearing all the new stuff people are having too. My site is Linda Addison Writer. And then I'm all over every place as Linda Addison or Nightbird 45. I mean, you just put in Linda Addison, there I am. Even though I'm not here so much. I'm not here, and I'm only here in one dimension.
Well, you'll have to work on your materialization at some point.
Obviously. Ave.
Oh my gosh. Max.
Yeah, I'm on all the everything except Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. I'm at CyberGodWrites on most of that. And I have a really weirdly named website because I wasn't thinking about it when I made it. It's thewellsoftheweird.com. One day I'll change it. Yeah, my latest poetry collection came out from Rawlik Screening Press in August. And I'm also in Dark Spores with a poem. I just had all of them listed, and I just forgot. I'll have something in Cracking the Code. I did something in Shadows and Verse, and that just came out. And a new anthology from Erie River Publishing called When the Earth Bleeds at Night. I'll have a poem in that as well, and a few other things that I can't talk about yet. But other than that, just staying busy. So
terrific. Well, I put links to where you can order Where the Silent Ones Watch in the chat in case anybody is interested in picking up a copy and checking out these stories and poems. And before we wind up, I'll just say, for those of you who are not familiar with Galactic Terrors, our online reading series runs the second Thursday of the month, every month, more or less. And you can please click subscribe to our YouTube channel if you'd like to be notified about upcoming transmissions. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which does not spam you. It goes out just a couple of times a month to remind everyone that we have a broadcast coming up and who's on it. And our next one will be on November 14th. So I hope some of you watching tonight will join us again in a few weeks for the next installment of Galactic Terrors. So thanks again to all of our readers tonight, all of our authors. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you, one, submitting your wonderful stories and poems for the book, and then sharing with us tonight your inspirations and ideas for it, and giving us a little taste of the story and the poems. It's very much appreciated, and I hope everyone out there who reads this book will enjoy it.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Happy to be in it. Love it. Love.
Very happy.
Right. So thanks, everybody, and we will hopefully see you again soon on Galactic Terrors. Also, just this should be on YouTube by tomorrow if you want to share this with anybody or come back and listen to any of these wonderful readings again. All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
All right. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Waving.